So some of you are in LA and have lost homes, have lost belongings, and some of you might be mourning something that you've lost a long time ago. All of that is welcome. This is Mourning the Stuff Lost, hosted by me, that's grief coach Charlene Lamb, and my special guest is Dr. Julie Shaw of Hello, I'm Grieving. So you are all welcome wherever you are in your grief, wherever you are in your losses. I think that as grievers, meeting ourselves where we are is so important. Meeting ourselves where we are in our process of losing and also in our processes of grieving and mourning. We need to feel safe in order to grieve. I fundamentally believe that. So again, like if it feels like you're in a storm of loss, if you're dressed in survival mode, I definitely felt like I didn't really grieve or feel too much or was able to access too much of my emotions in the first year after my mom died because it was so sudden. I was just in survival mode. So checking in with yourself, see what feels safe to you.
Someone else had asked the question of are these just physical things, right? And I think it's a multitude of when we talk about stuff or the things that we've lost or that we're mourning, it really is up to you. It's the same thing just with how individualized our grief is, how individualized we are as humans, and the individualized experiences that we have, that what we are defining as stuff and the things that we have lost and that we will mourn, that is up to you. And I think that there's a lot of power in that, in saying that this is my thing. This is my stuff. I think even as we go through life, we talk about the baggage that we're carrying. This is my stuff.
A question that I like to ask people is, what's your relationship with stuff? Because usually in the context of grief, I find that it gets all jumbled together. Like when we think of grieving and mourning, that it's like, oh, in my example, right? There's my relationship with my mom, there's my relationship with her house, there's my relationship with losing my mother and that experience, and then there's the relationship with her stuff, which took over my life for 2 years while I figured out her estate. And then there's also the relationship with my stuff. And then tangential to that, there's like, oh, my husband's relationship to stuff, which looks very different from my relationship with stuff. So I think that might be interesting for you. And when I say you, I mean generally everyone, for us to consider, what is my relationship with stuff? Has my relationship with stuff changed after significant loss? So example, the soy sauce in my mother's kitchen. When my mother was alive, I have never gotten teary over the soy sauce and her cooking oils before. After she died, that soy sauce represented so much and it felt so precious. Loss can also affect, well, our grief responses, right? How we respond to grief can vary so much. I know that my grief response changed in terms of my relationship with stuff. I always enjoyed things, I enjoyed belongings, but suddenly stuff represented my connection to my mother. Stuff represented connection to my grandmother in a much deeper way. Stuff represented security in a much deeper way. I had lost my mother, who was my security. So now her house or her stuff represented security.
I think even understanding, which again, just how diverse and individual we are, the cultural perspective also comes into play here, is how we are brought up, what's passed down, even how we show up in the world, that these are also things on how we learn our connection to things, her in this different way. Because when you talked about that judgment, a lot of the times what can fracture a lot of relationships when people are grieving is that judgment. Because we may find ourselves judging how people grieve, and if they grieve differently from us, then we may see that there's something wrong, right? doing some of that unpacking and digging down the layers to that. And you can make those connections, even historical connections, as to finding out the why.
Generational trauma, for sure. We inherit those too. And how I mentioned grief responses earlier, and how the way that we relate to belongings and the potential for future loss, those can also be trauma responses. Stuff, all that's connected to the stuff, what does the stuff represent? And how can we give ourselves that permission and that space to acknowledge and to see, oh, yeah, that's connected to it. This story, this memory, this experience. Let me give you a visual. One of the reasons I love using the metaphor of a gallery space is that, to me, an art gallery is an invitation to see. A museum is an invitation to see, to have the space to see different things, but also to see things in different ways, in different angles, from different angles. The artist's intent, the curator's interpretation, but also what's your interpretation? So, an example, I like to think of these items as anchor objects. And again, this can be a specific object, something that you thought of, right? Someone's mentioned a couch or a can of Coke. Maybe it's a necklace, something that comes up for you and what's attached to that. So, for instance, the story that kind of haunts my family a bit in terms of something we've lost. My grandmother died when I was 5. So I have very few memories of her, but I remember her jewelry. And I was always told her jewelry, Pawpaw's jewelry, will be yours. When I was 10, my parents and I moved to California. And at some point, my mom and I visited New York, where we were from, and she tried to take my grandmother's jewelry back to California with us. And in that process, it all got stolen. So when I think of my grandmother's jewelry, oh gosh, what's attached to it? There's connection, there's family connection, right? Then my strongest memories of my pawpaw were her jewelry. There's the pain of, that's another part of her gone. I barely remember her. Now her jewelry's gone too. What else is attached? There's so much more that's attached. There was a police report. There was, I think, my grandfather's Rolex watch in that bag. There were jade bangles. There's grief, my mom's grief, my grief. What are the layers that we unpack? Let me try to zoom in on this a bit more. So there was definitely my grief, but then as I got older, recognizing my mom's grief, different emotions, right? And if this is bringing up anything for anyone, right, be kind to yourself. There was anger because I was like, that was supposed to be mine. That was supposed to be my inheritance. I was angry at my mother. Why wasn't she more careful? This was precious stuff. And I was just a kid because she told me to hang on to the bag, but she didn't tell me what was in the bag. And at some point, my uncle told me to put it in the car, and someone came by and took it from the car. I was just a kid. Why did she give that bag to me? And another layer. I feel so much gratitude that my mother never blamed me, even though that was one of the worst things she's ever experienced in her life. She never blamed me. And then there was compassion. I was just a kid. And my mom felt so bad about this. Right? So all of that anchored to my grandmother's story. So I want to invite you to do that too, to think about whatever's come up for you, something that you've been missing, something that you wish you still had. Could be a house, could be a specific object, could be something more amorphous. What is attached to it for you? And then do this exercise just for the next couple of minutes. What does it represent to you? Can be something you've lost, or it can be something that just has a lot of like emotional charge for you, that's precious to you. what we're doing is we're allowing the meaningful object to show us, to help us see what's attached.
I've always loved it when and I think to me,
Mhm.
you've explained this like with the strings and how you do, how everything's connected. But this visual is very, very good because I think when we start to think about this the way I am, it's like you can kind of feel like your mind starts to go in all these circles and but this is very organized in looking at it this way and breaking down the layers. I think I can speak from the point of view living in LA and witnessing everything that was happening. And for me, as you were going through this, I was like, oh, okay, these are the more connectors. And I was writing things down is the stuff that I feel like I lost living here in LA. Um, and some people may feel guilty about saying these things, but I'll say it, is the places that I will never get to go to anymore, that are just gone. And I think a lot of us may think of the iconic drive up PCH and how I know a lot of us saw in Topanga. I used to go surfing there, and there was the motel across the street. And every time you would see that, or Rosenthal's Winery, I know there's a lot of privilege as I say this out loud too, right? Acknowledging that. And even with Moonshadow's restaurant, like I've never eaten there. I've never gone to these places, but I've driven by them so many times. And I would say I've still had this connection because there was a longing to go there. And I think what it brought up for me is it was the loss of these experiences. It was to the loss of being able to create memories, the loss of having beauty in my life. And as you're talking about curating and designing my life, is like I wanted to have that beauty. I wanted to have those experiences. Yes, I can see that at the Topanga feed store, right? And it's like and the thing is, you can see them so vividly. I've driven by it so many times. And it also made me think about how this parallels with even grieving a person, because there are moments that we have that we tell ourselves, oh, I can go see that person, tomorrow, or I can go visit them next week, or we'll plan a trip. We'll do that. And so even these physical places, I now I'm kind of kicking myself and I may feel guilty or I may feel angry at myself for like, why didn't you just go? Why didn't you just do that and add that to your life? Because now I can't do that. And when you put that gratitude, which I also believe sometimes people can have a hard time finding the gratitude in grief, and that's okay. And is understanding that I do have gratitude still for living in an amazing city. And I still have gratitude still that I did have the privilege to see that and to see those structures when they were here and to have that history still baked into my memory. And so I think grief plays a role in that where we kind of toggle back and forth between having that gratitude and still mourning the things that we've lost. So I don't know if that exactly. I see that tomorrow is not promised. Life can stop on the turn of a dime, and the fires taught us that. Absolutely. My home was not affected. However, a few months before those fires, I actually did have a fire at my house next door. Our neighbor's garage caught on fire to where it was, I'm telling you, inches from our home. And to see the big infernos, and I think even to see what was happening on TV, I know I experienced a fraction, a minute fraction. Um, but I still felt that connection to people because I had to run across, like by these fires where the firefighters, after they came, they said, do not go back there. There are down wires, like you could die. And I had literally just moments before, I had just ran to my garage to go get my car out. And in an instant, I had to tell myself, if I lose everything, I'm gonna lose everything. And so I think these are a lot of things that can come up in these losses as well.
I like to encourage making space for all of it, making space for the anger, make space for the resentment, the sense of betrayal. Thank you for that beautiful share. Like so vulnerable and naming, like you said, so vividly, all the things that we think of in the moment, but then after the fact, we remember, oh gosh, yeah, it's stuff, just stuff, but it really represents a previous version of myself, right? College days, fond memories. Maybe it's a connection to childhood. Maybe it's a connection to heritage, right? Photos come up a lot. I'm like, those were the only photos of my ancestors. That was my main connection to a sense of belonging or a sense of home. What am I going to be able to show my kids of like, this is what your ancestor looked like, and you have her eyes, right? All of that is attached to the physical stuff. So just when I say make space for grief, I love the example that Julie gave too, because it has so many of the ands. There's the gratitude, and there is the resentment and sense of betrayal. There's the loss of trust, the loss of belief that people know what they're doing. And I think also in the what we're seeing a lot with natural disasters and with climate change, and even with COVID, losses when we've been doing everything right. Losses through no fault of our own, when we were living in the right place, when we planned, when we strategized, when we followed the rules, and still there was major loss. I just want to acknowledge that range and invite us to try to make space for all of it. And I very firmly believe that when we make space for all of that, we also make more space for joy, for what comes next that we might want to have come next.